With me is Professor James Piscatori, who is a renowned professor of international relations and head of in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. Professor Piscatori is an expert on political Islam and a member of the Center for the History of Political Thought, and previously a fellow at the Oxford Center of Islamic Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Professor, you delivered a very interesting topic on the Arab Spring and how it relates to the democratization of Islamic society, so to speak, if I can use that phrase. One of the ideas I get from your speech is that Islam is getting democratized, but there is this argument among some Islamists who tends to look at it from a different perspective. They say that democracy, being a non-monolithic ideology, is being Islamized. What is your comment on that?
I think there's a huge debate now in Muslim circles, and by the way, outside Muslim circles in the West, about whether or not Islam and democracy are compatible. And I think my position is that if you look at the theology, if you look at the ideas of Islam, you really have a whole range of ideas, but this is the same that you would say about any religious tradition. Okay. If you would ask me, is democracy Christianized, or whatever, I could say, well, it's the same sort of thing. You pick and choose out of scripture or the sources of the religion what you want to justify your position. So first of all, I think it's just used. Islam is kind of an instrument to legitimize your own position, whatever that position is. Now, if you ask me if they're compatible, in fact, I would say that there is nothing in those Islamic norms which would prohibit it. There's nothing which precludes it. That there are ideas which could be used to develop it, but that really depends on people. What I was saying is that that in Islam, I think there are a whole set of ideas. There's nothing that would prevent or preclude the development of democracy. It depends on individuals. It depends on people who have the will to develop it in those ways, and also, of course, if the conditions in the society, such as economic justice, are part of it.
Yeah, and you did mention, touching on when you said depend on people, you did mention about the complete absence, and I don't know whether that's the exact word you used.
Yes.
Of civic institutions in the Arab nations, which could help in the process of democratization in their societies. But what do you really mean by a complete absence?
This was not my view. This was the view of some people who argue that these civic institutions, what we would think of as civil society, that they were missing, that they're absent. And there is a historical argument there. The historical argument is that there was the caliph and the society was top down. And so that there weren't these kind of institutions, these smaller institutions in Islamic history. That in itself is debatable. But in the modern period, oh yes, I think there are human rights groups, there are women's activist groups, student groups, not quite probably as many as there are in Southeast Asia or Malaysia, but some. Okay,
but is it possible that you were looking at things from a purely Western variant? For example, the role of civil societies. Is there any kind of version in the Arab world or in the Muslim societies for that kind of role?
Now there is, yes. I mean, you're right to question it though, because in some ways, because in the past, people would say either there's nothing, or there are things like tribes, or even the ulama, the religious officials, and you would say but are they really civil society groups? You know, so there is a question as to whether, say, traditionally they existed. What I would say is that if we're talking about today, you know, just like in Southeast Asia, you have in the Arab world, you have all these people who have been well educated, have gone overseas, well, you know, etc. Young professionals, they have formed organizations, and some of them are promoting sort of civic values. So I'd say yes, now there are some. But by the way, can I also say this? The governments have been aware of it. And the governments have been trying to control them. So you know there's the phrase NGO, non-governmental organization. In the Middle East, people talk about governmental, non-governmental organizations, meaning the government says they are an NGO, but they control all the money.
They got one hand in their pocket.
Well, they got one in their pocket, exactly. So they're not free.
Okay. I'm also, I can't help notice that, you know, when you were speaking on the Arab Spring, you actually had Iran and Turkey, two nations which are non-Arabic speaking, or for that matter non-Arab nations, which you included in your analysis. May I ask why is that?
I suppose it was only the idea of kind of that there is a sort of revolt, you know, going on. I mean, there was a revolution in the case of Iran, so I suppose it's not. You're quite right. It's not doesn't strictly belong. But I could have said, which I didn't. A questioner asked me about the external factors. I could have said that, of course, one of the arguments that the Bahrainis are making is that there, which I think is wrong, that there would not be internal dissent within Bahrain had it not been for Iran making mischief. I don't think that's quite right.
Okay. And while we are on it, there's another. I thought it was an omission. There was no mention about Israel in the analysis. Is that because you don't consider Israel as a Middle Eastern state, or right in the center of the Arab world? Or?
No, I think here's how I argue that. I think Israel, of course, is important for everything in the Arab world. I mean, it conditions everything. So in the larger, broader sense, Egypt did not help its development by the fact that it had to maintain a large military against Israel. The weaponry, etc. So all of that, of course, skewed the development plans of all the Arab countries. That's true. And it's probably also the case that there were other relations that were involved. But I ask, you know, there's a way of arguing called counterfactuals. I ask you a counterfactual question. If there was no Israel, would there still have been discontents and authoritarianism in the Arab world? Yes. And that's that's what I think they're reacting to. Now, it is true that a lot of the authoritarianism was defended in the name of we had to stay, you had to be loyal to the regime because we're in a war with Israel. So the regimes often used it as a way of defending authoritarianism. But I still believe that if there's no Israel at all in the map, you still would have narrowly based regimes, you would still have vast economic injustices, just uneven distribution of wealth, all the kind of social problems, which would someday add up to revolt.
Yet at the same time, the fact is that these are the same regimes which had been very supportive of the Western policies on Israel, for example. And when you said that these regimes were using Israel as a boogeyman, how do you?
Well, some did. I mean, Libya did
for domestic politics.
For domestic politics reasons, and even it is true. I mean, it's true that Egypt is in a peace treaty with Israel, but you know. There was always the argument that if Israel had to maintain a certain stability internally, because if it didn't, then Israel would still exploit its hegemonic power in the region. So I do think that even the ones who are supportive of, say, Western policy towards Israel used it at times.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned about Bahrain, and I don't know. I think it was a bit cursory mention
Very.
Of what I felt was a very important part of the Arab Spring, if you can call it. What is your take on the role of Saudi Arabia and Qatar in Syria, in an entirely, if you like, pro change or pro reform kind of position, as opposed to the Saudis' blatant, very open rule in Bahrain?
Absolutely.
What is your
understanding? And in a way, to add to that, an ambivalence on Mubarak, but close to support for Mubarak. You know, exactly. And they didn't want him to fall. Although they didn't love him, but they didn't want him to fall. Absolutely. This is I think it's a very interesting pattern. The Saudis are basically doing what they feel is in their interests. That it's got nothing to do with any kind of pan-Arab brotherhood or pan-Islamic brotherhood. It's basically got to do with in the case of Bahrain, the fear is that it would immediately go into Saudi Arabia, and that this would also encourage they see it as Iran making mischief. So naturally they want to support it very greatly. In the case of Syria, of course, it's a little bit more complicated. Some people argue it's the Sunni Shi'i thing, that in fact the Saudis are feeling increasingly encircled by a kind of a rise of political Shiism, which is, I think, partly true. But of course, it's also the case that politically, foreign policy, the Syrians and the Saudis don't see eye to eye, and they never have. And so the Syrians wouldn't be, the Saudis wouldn't be unhappy to see Assad go, but I think they're also having second thoughts a bit, because they don't also want to see the collapse of Lebanon and the spillover.
Okay. And also you mentioned about Iran and Turkey in your analysis, and I think you mentioned that we all had this impression of the presence of some form of democracy in Iran until the presidential election debacle of 2009.
Exactly.
And in the same breath, we mentioned about Turkey until 2 days ago. But isn't this, if you take the Iran example, for example, if you take the Iran 2009 election, don't you think this is just a Middle East variant of what had taken place in Florida in 2004?
Hanging chads. No, I think it's so in other words, what you're suggesting is that it's a kind of misfiring of the system, of the whole process. The process collapses.
How different is that from,
I think you could say that to a certain extent. And what's interesting is that in retrospect, I think many people would kind of say maybe the opposition wasn't as popular as everyone thought in 2009, when everyone claimed that they were robbed. I think now, with an interim few years, of course it's getting all hot again because of the present election, but I think maybe people might think that opposition wasn't so strong.
That could be, for example, some kind of generational gap or technological gap, because the opposition had all the Twitter tools with them.
Yes, exactly. And there was a kind of almost unequal firepower there between the young people who were well armed and the regime who didn't know what they were doing and couldn't handle it.
And the protests in Turkey you were mentioning. Do you not think that this is itself, for the people to go out and protest itself, is a form of of the vibrancy of democracy, so to speak, instead of losing the legitimacy of the government?
No, I mean, I think in many ways it shows the strength of the system. Again, it depends on how you interpret all of these sort of things. As I was trying to say earlier, one of the normal patterns of political protest is that you should somehow root it through the institutions of state. So you root it through the parliament, you root it through your representatives, you root it through the media, etc. and normally that is the way in a way you diffuse the idea of sort of street protests. But it may also be the case that a vibrant democracy sort of
have some trouble on the streets.
Well, it's confident enough to allow it. It's confident enough to say that it doesn't necessarily have to turn into an overthrow of the system. That is an expression of people's opinion. So I don't know. In some ways, it'd be interesting. I think the AKP government is an Erdogan. We'll see. I mean, they may lose their sure-footedness, but I mean, up until now, they've been pretty sure-footed, and they may have been a little bit more upfront about imposing their agenda, but I think it's going too far to say they're anti-democratic, and that they're stifling all opposition.
And I was attracted by when you said about the demography factor to predict the future of any authoritarian government. Would you rate for example our chances of a more vocal opposition?
Well, I was talking to some people earlier about this, and people from here who were thinking that it has some relevance for here. I mean, I want to be clear. I mean, I'm not a demographer, and I think it's an attractive idea. But like any idea in the social sciences, you really can't be too predictive. I mean, it's not rocket science, so there are always many variables to put into the complex equation. So it's one among many factors, but there is something to this, and there's something to it in a couple of ways. One is that you've got the younger cohort of the population, so the 15, 16-year-olds to the early 20s, who perhaps are the ones that can go out on the street more. You can recruit them for kind of the political flash mob sort of thing,
They have a lot of time on their hands as well.
All right. Okay, there you go.
With us are Dato Seri Anwar Ibrahim, Opposition Leader of the Malaysian Parliament, and Professor James Piscatori, who is Professor of International Relations and Head of School in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Dato Seri Anwar, Professor James Piscatori, he delivered a lecture on Arab Spring, and many couldn't help but draw comparisons between what he has raised on the factors that contribute to the Arab Spring and the factors in our own setting. What is your comment? Is Malaysia ripe for such a movement, and how will it be different than the movement in these countries?
Well, it's unfortunate I was not able to attend the lecture. I was in Penang, but then it's interesting that some of the participants, particularly from the Bar Council, was here, was updating me some of the issues, the parallels, and some of the issues raised, which I think is relevant. Essentially, it is an upsurge, awakening against an authoritarian rule on the oppressive system where people want and demand change. Now, in our case, my dream at that time was to ensure that we would be seen or perceived to be unique in the sense that we affect change through electoral process. That was essentially my thinking. It's still clamoring for change, for reform of the institutions, even the whole understanding concept notion of growth, of ethnic relations, of development, relevance of religion and culture, particularly in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society like Malaysia. So where we share is of course the clamor for reform, freedom, the old notion of this authoritarian rule that leaders know best, and through their corrupt and parsimonious policies need to change. And I think those issues are quite settled. But to be more objective, I must concede that the problems, both social or political, even economic problems in Malaysia, of course, not as acute as in Egypt or Tunisia.
Mm-hmm.
Had the opportunity to be in Tunisia with Sherah Shaghanusi in the cabinet and look at the figures. Clearly, issues of unemployment, of poverty, of development is just too chronic
on a
to
bigger
use,
scale.
yeah.
So would you say that you still have some kind of trust in the system to be able to effect change through the system, or what do you think?
Well, the tragedy about the whole experience in Malaysia is the failure to recognize on the part of the ruling clique that the transition is critical to avoid civil strife.
Mm-hmm.
Had they respected the sentiments, wishes of the people, conduct fair, free elections, which they did not, have at least some limited access to the media, which did not happen at all. Not even a minute of airtime was given to any of us, including to me, as leader of the opposition, throughout the campaign period. And they still call it a fair election. And you still have people like Bob Carr, the Foreign Minister of Australia, saying, yes, we are impressed with the electoral process because of business interests, investments, etc. But of course, it would not be regarded as anyway close to what is internationally acceptable practice of a fair, free system. Now, having said that, we have a problem. What do? Do we just accept it as fait accompli, face the next elections? I said, no. We won not only popular vote, we actually won the elections. And we have now adduced enough evidence to support our claim. Now, so we have had a series of rallies, peaceful ones, this stadium. Our leaders have been arrested, charged in court for unlawful assembly. And I don't think it would end at that. I have said it, that we have won. They must come to terms. The Election Commission must resign for the incompetence and complicity in the crime, in terms of not only the abatement, but clear involvement in fraud and mass rigging, which is now in evidence. We are fortunate with the social networking, which is, of course, we draw same parallels as in the Arab world, the Arab Spring. I sometimes take a note of advice from Qaradawi, who said, why have a spring when it should be an awakening? But it's okay, it's because terminology, semantics.
And Professor, do you see similarities between the Arab Spring in its early days, early days before the self-immolation of Bouazizi, for example, in Tunisia? Do you see the similarities with Malaysia's situation?
You know, without knowing the Malaysian situation, of course, as well as you do, when I began all this and in fact, even giving the lecture today, I would have thought no. I would have said that there's not. The circumstances are so different. Egypt is so different from Malaysia, and it's more, as you say, it's sort of more extreme. It was more extreme in the case of the Arab world than here. But in the analysis, I sort of articulated some factors. And you know, those factors do seem to be relevant to the case of Malaysia. So, you know, in addition to the obvious ones, that is to say social and economic injustices, In addition to that, you have, of course, the perception of an authoritarian government. You have the perception of corruption, or the reality of corruption. But I also, my argument was that in effect you have almost a disjunction. You have the society rises up in the Middle East and it has social authority, but it doesn't have the political power. It's still being held by, say, the military, still being held by the old institutions. Those who are ruling the societies have the institutions, in a way, the administrative power, but they lack the authority.
Mm.
They lack the social authority. And in some ways I'm beginning to wonder if that's exactly what is the condition in Malaysia.
Mm.
That in a way you have a society which has authority. It is trying to reach beyond the old ways of legitimizing power, so racial, ethnic terms, and because it's doing it on the basis of democracy, because it's doing it on the basis of civic values, then that has a kind of a social authority. Society has authority. But those who are ruling have administrative power, but are starting to lose that legitimacy.
And
So in that sense, it's almost pre-Arab Spring.
Pre-Arab, okay. And you mentioned, Professor mentioned just now that one of the things that impedes the rise, the faster democratization of Islamic societies or the Arab societies is the absence of civil societies. But in our case, there are many civil societies and NGOs, and yet there is this very slow process of reform in Malaysia, or to go to that open opposition against the government.
There's always a disconnect. If you have any semi-authoritarians, there is a disconnect between the thinking of the ruling clique and the sentiments of the masses. Otherwise, there will not be a spring if they actually understand and empathize with the sentiments of the vast majority. And we are fortunate in the sense that the political parties are mature, and the civil society have been very active and very vocal. And the action, the repressions from the 80s, 90s did not only involve political party leaders, but also social activists, student leaders, unions, and civil society organizations. And therefore, to my mind, we are fortunate, as Professor James said, that when people see the position of the ruling establishment and the new social fabric demanding or clamoring for change, you actually sense there's a whole approach conceptually in terms of ethnic relations, or the role of religion, or economic policies. There's always this vast difference. It makes it simpler in terms of articulating our case. But having said that, it's not as simple, because we still have somebody's tweet to say, well, I mean, from professors or from student leaders who say that the Malay interests will be severely compromised. Christianity will be made religion of the federation in place of Islam. And that the country will now become close to Israel. Things like that. It still is a very vicious campaign. Of course, I'm the chief target.
You can imagine.
And but people, so other than political authority, this sort of discussion at an intellectual plane is very important.
And because he mentioned about the what he was trying to say is about the racial cards being played. Do you think that means Malaysia, its geopolitics and its composition is more challenging than the Arab regimes?
I think there are similarities too there, because regimes in the Arab world to defend their authoritarianism, invoke the Islamic card, invoke the ethnic card, And so that's common.
Yeah, but there is a perception that the Arab states are more homogeneous. As opposed to Malaysia.
There is, but of course the reality is a little bit different. I mean, so there are, say, the Berbers, there are the Kurds, which are different from it. There's an overpowering ideology of Arabism, which supposedly gave one identity, but in fact there's a little. They often used it against their own internal enemies. As a way of getting conformity and authoritarianism. On this point about civil society, I just want to say, I think you're absolutely right. What I was trying to say was that not that civil society was entirely absent in the Arab world. It was developing, and the small positive bit is that helped to educate people to sort of public discourse. But where it went wrong, and I don't know the situation here, where it went wrong is the government controlling those civil society organizations. So that in so doing, you cut off that alternative voice, and you really only have the official voice in a way, and that kind of stimulates further opposition. So insofar as civil society groups can articulate the alternative and keep it, let's say, above racial politics, keep it above ethnic, keep it above even Islamic politics, talk about the civic values of tolerance, pluralism, the things that Anwar always talks about. I think these are, that's the way to build a kind of democratic future.
There's one caveat to that, because when we deal with the Arab Spring, there's always this tendency to give recognition, which is, to me, rightfully so, to the new social networking of the new generation. But there's also a very powerful piece in the foreign affairs that I read, not necessarily to debunk this, but to suggest that, look at the ground, the village communities, the mosque cells, and the not necessarily all ikhwan, but the groupings has also a huge, tremendous influence. But probably they were not able to affect that change because it's seen still to be quite parochial, representing one group.
Yes.
So this actually became a major catalyst. Like here we can claim that the political parties have been strong, formidable, but the presence of the civil society actually helped, because then they broaden the issues, the message, because they will have their own interest groups, and they will compel us party leaders to respond, either to accept, adjust, or reject.
That's precisely my point. That civil society, when it works like this, is actually building above those other ways of doing those very narrow, ethnic, particularistic ways. Yeah, it's speaking a broader language, and in speaking that broader language, it's like a school for democracy. So, I mean, to me, this is why these groups. I mean, you yourself were involved in them originally. This pushes things along.